The following podcast is scheduled for a 30-minute time limit. Introducing your hosts. First, broadcasting out of North Bay, Ontario, Canada, the Black Scorpion, Have Co5. And his podcast partner, the Lone Horseman, Matthew Super.
Welcome to the Wrasslun Show. I'm at Adam Co5. That's at Matthew Sucra. Matt, another week has gone by, and how are we doing this week?
Doing great. Ready for what should be a awesome event for the WWE this weekend.
For a moment there, I thought you were talking about Northland Wrestling's Miller Memorial Cup 2.
Yeah, that's going to be awesome as well.
November 4th, just to put that out there.
If you haven't seen it yet, please check your local listings on Kojiko TV in North Bay.
Or just visit TMZ.com and see our buddy
You can do that too.
Jerry O'Connell shirtless, as that was a good time.
It was awesome. That was a very, very good show put on by Northland Wrestling. It was an absolute pleasure to call, and I can't wait to do the next one with you.
It's going to be a lot of fun. Hopefully I can keep my mouth in check for the next commentary. Sometimes I let my mouth get the better of me when I'm a heel.
That's right.
Kind of like the guy we're talking about today, Matt. This guy got himself into trouble on more than a few occasions with the things he would say.
Yeah, a couple times.
Some of the promos he used to cut back in the day probably wouldn't fly in this modern PG era of the WWE. But he did thrive during another PG era with them. So who knows? Maybe, certainly I'm not at the level of our topic of conversation today, but maybe in my own mind. We'll see. Of course, we're talking today about the one, the only, the nature boy, Ric Flair. Matt, I see you over there. You've been holding in a woo since we've started this podcast. If you want to let one out, go ahead.
Woo!
There you go. You just sent our listeners' eardrums bursting. I love it. It's a good thing. It's a good thing on this episode. Yeah. The nature boy. He's not doing so well.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. Let's catch everyone up to speed if you haven't heard about it. Ric Flair was hospitalized in intensive care on Saturday. Took kind of everyone by surprise. I didn't even hear about it until the next day on Sunday. And Dave Meltzer wrote on the Wrestling Observer, he noted on Wrestling Observer Radio that he was in a lot of pain when he went to the hospital, and his condition was said to be pretty bad. Meltzer said things were not looking good for Flair at one point, and WWE Hall of Famer Michael P.S. Hayes had tweeted after he paid a visit to Flair in the hospital pretty much the same thing, that things were looking pretty bleak for Flair, and a lot of people, unfortunately, quick to talk about his demise. And of course, we want to reiterate, as of this recording, that has not yet happened. But here's what has happened. Flair was placed into a medically induced coma this past Monday before colon surgery in order to remove a blockage that was the catalyst for a number of health issues that has followed, including kidney failure. And at the time of this recording, Flair is currently on kidney dialysis, and doctors are looking to get his kidneys back functioning. Surgery was considered a success, so they removed that blockage from his colon, but there are more issues to deal with right now. So we're in this holding pattern, if you will, this idea of Ric Flair. I won't say hanging on by a thread because I'm not his doctor. I don't know. But we're in a kind of touch and go situation with the Nature Boy. And of course, this immediately leads people to thinking back upon his career and all the great memories they've had with Flair. And that's what we're going to do today. And I don't want anybody to think that this is a podcast announcing the premature passing of Ric Flair. That's not what we're doing. Certainly, all we wish for Ric Flair and his friends and family is a speedy and healthy recovery. We want to have Ric Flair styling and profiling for many, many years to come. I want him riding limousines and flying jets until he's dead, but I don't want that day to be today. I don't want it to be anytime soon. I want it to be many, many years into the future. But, the world sometimes isn't fair. So I don't want to say in preparation for the worst, but of course, with that being the major headline that a lot of fans are talking about, it is something that we wanted to address today. Before we take our first break, Matt, let me ask you something that's it's a morbid question to ask, but it is one that I think is appropriate for wrestling fans. When did wrestling deaths stop shocking you? When was it like, oh, yeah, another one?
In some ways it still hasn't, because it always depends on who the guy or girl is.
Sure.
I
I cried.
There was a slate there where there was quite a few within a couple of years. This was in, I was still in high school, and it was like Miss Elizabeth, and then shortly after, Lex Luger passed away.
No, Luger actually. Here, I'll give you some good news, Matt. Luger's still alive. He is still alive.
Hang on.
Right
so
now.
what am I? I'm sorry. I apologize.
That's okay. Miss Elizabeth did pass away, unfortunately.
There was
in
someone
2003.
really shortly. I'm glad he's still around. Then
Yes.
that's awesome.
That is good news.
Then what isn't it like? Crash Holly passed away.
Yeah, he is
and then
unfortunately left us.
Mr. Perfect was shortly after him. Mm-hmm. Macho Man came after that. Actually, that was a little more recent. And then, of course, with Eddie and Benoit, there was a slate there where there was a couple of months and successive years where there was very well-known names that were just dropping by, and so that was when it was tough to hear, but also it was still shocking to hear. But at the same time, it's going, yeah, that's kind of the unfortunate reality of that business.
Now, the good news is, not the case here. Ric Flair's still with us. Thank goodness. And when we come back from the break, we're going to talk about how we discovered the Nature Boy and some of our favorite matches.
I'm Andrew Kent, and here's 5 reasons to listen to the We Have Co5 podcast on the Wrasslun Show Network. Number 5, I'm handsome. Not that you would notice. Number 4, I love wrestling. You love wrestling. We both love wrestling, so you'll love this podcast. Number 3, I talk about everything, from worst pay-per-view names to best Chris Jericho feuds. Number 2, lists are pretty fun. And number 1, everyone's got their favorites. Where does mine line up with yours? Find out every Friday on the Wrasslun Show Network.
Woo! All right. Enough of that sentimental garbage. Let's talk about limousine riding, jet flying, kiss stealing, wheeling dealing, son of a guns. Or more specifically, one son of a gun. The man who did it, well, according to a lot of people, the absolute best. The Nature Boy, Ric Flair, who's custom made from head to toe. Sit down, fat boy. I'll take your mom to Space Mountain. We know it all because Ric Flair is arguably the best ever. I first discovered Ric Flair during his initial WWF run from 1991 until 1993 because growing up as a youth, I didn't really get exposed to any wrestling outside of WWF. It was WWF, and that was it. As far as I was concerned, they were wrestling. And a lot of my wrestling consisted of old tapes that my uncle had and videos that I rented from the video store. And of course, one of my favorites was Royal Rumble 1992. And you cannot talk about Royal Rumble 1992 without thinking about Ric Flair. The two are synonymous. It's where he won his first ever WWF World Championship, where he put on one of the greatest performances in Rumble history, going far over an hour and outlasting some of the biggest names in the entire business. You add in Bobby Heenan's hilarious commentary on top of that, and you've got a moment, a career-defining moment. But the thing is, I never really knew about Ric Flair's illustrious WCW and NWA career until probably, I'd say, the late 90s, during the Monday Night War, essentially, when WCW finally made themselves a presence in Canada. But that's when I was first exposed to the Nature Boy. And to me, I hated his guts. Everything about him I hated. Of course, he was against Hulk Hogan and the Macho Man, and those were my guys when I was a kid. So I absolutely hated Ric Flair. He did his job every time he was on screen. He made me want to live vicariously through Hogan and Macho Man dropping elbows and leg drops. What about you? How were you first exposed to Ric Flair?
Yeah, it was a guy that I knew of growing up, and again, I didn't get into wrestling hardcore until the WWF Attitude Era was starting to really dominate the Monday Night Wars. But when he showed up at the tail end of the Invasion angle and was the what was the word he used? The consortium buyer. And
that's right.
That he was partners with Vince McMahon.
What a moment.
Just when his music hit and the crowd reacted and the words Ric Flair flashed across the Titantron, it was goosebumps. Oh my God, Ric Flair is here.
Yeah.
And it between that storyline going into the Evolution storyline was some of the best work he had done in a long time, and it was captivating to see him still go.
I want to get to that because when he came back to the WWF in 2001, my opinion of Ric Flair at that time was not very high, only because I wasn't familiar with a lot of his WCW work pre-1998. And by that time, even though Ric Flair could still go, I was seeing him through the lens and the picture that WCW at that time had painted him as, which was
an old guy.
Old, broken down. And Ric Flair has made no secret about this. By the time he got to the WWF, he had lost a lot of confidence in himself. And I remember specifically thinking that when they announced his street fight with Vince McMahon at the Royal Rumble, which is one of my favorite Ric Flair matches of all time.
Hands down.
My thought was the reason they were making it a street fight was that so Ric Flair could fight in a t-shirt because he was so out of shape. Of course, he didn't do that.
Yeah.
And then he went on to have another one of my all-time favorite Ric Flair matches.
I know what you're
by
talking
going
about.
toe-to-toe with The Undertaker at WrestleMania 18. Holy cow. And then I started seeing Ric Flair in a whole new light because I did not realize... I knew who Ric Flair was, but I didn't know who the Nature Boy was. And then I started to go back and started to research, and WWE made a lot more of their stuff available. And man, were my eyes opened at that point. What are some of your favorite Ric Flair matches?
Yeah, those two you mentioned right off the top of my head are great. Obviously, I didn't live through the era where he was this dominant NWA champion. And, you know, for the people that got to live through that, man, that was amazing wrestling to watch at that time. His battles with Ricky Steamboat and all those guys are some of the best matches you'll ever get to see. Obviously, in a different context and a completely different style, but it is captivating for that era. Even his matches against Sting before Sting became, you know, the Crow character when he was, you know, originally in the early NWA WCW days. Some of those matches are great to watch. But yeah, my favorite Ric Flair stuff is that street fight against Vince. That match against Taker at 18 for sure, and then, you know, his finale against HBK, and unfortunately there's a gap there that I feel was misused by the WWE. Whether it was, I don't know if it was Flair saying I can't go that hard and I need to space out my matches and I need to only have a match here and there kind of thing, or whether it was just we've got nothing for him, and that then he was just kind of used as a sideline character. But yeah, some of the stuff in between his return to WWE and the end of it with his finale against Shawn Michaels is very, very fun to watch. Even his stuff as I guess you could call him the manager of Evolution, was some of the best promo work of that era. Triple H didn't need Ric Flair to get over as a top heel, but boy, did that give him another crutch to shove in the face of fans. For all those fans that grew up watching Ric Flair and hating him because they wanted to be him, now you've got Triple H, who you already hate, buddying up with Ric Flair. Oh my God, did you want to throw up? It was great storytelling. Yes, there was some times when it was like, okay, this is too much of a push, but I think having Ric Flair there gave Evolution that extra edge they needed, and it really helped, I think, develop the careers of Randy Orton and Batista to where they got to be now for Orton and the kind of legacy that Batista had during his very good runs with the WWE.
Well, speaking of influence, I mean, you and I could sit here and talk about great Ric Flair matches probably for the entire episode, but we do want to cover a couple of different topics when it comes to the Nature Boy. After the break, we're going to talk about influence and how Ric Flair has influenced many entertainers, both inside and outside the squared circle. Hey, it's at Adam Conta.
Hey, I'm Drew Ferris.
We came up with the idea for this show, Ropes to Reels, where we talk about movies that have something to do with wrestling.
Could be anything. Could be the story. Could be the plot. Could be one of the executive producers. It's just got to rope around somehow to professional wrestling.
We're going to review everything from the Scorpion King to Ready to Rumble.
From The Wrestler to Scooby-Doo WrestleMania Mystery.
So grab your popcorn
And put on your elbow pads.
and join us in the theater of the mind every week for Ropes to Reels.
Streaming now on the Wrasslun Show Network.
Matt, I think it's fair to say that Ric Flair is hands down one of the most influential entertainers of all time, not just in professional wrestling, but in entertainment. I remember recently, within the last few years, an article that was put out by, I'm not sure what the name of it was. It was a hip hop magazine. And essentially it had an article talking about how Ric Flair was a gangster rapper before gangster rap. He was a guy, and they were interviewing rap stars who said 100% Ric Flair was an inspiration for me and my hip hop music. And I mean, when you look at it, think about Ric Flair styling.
I'm drawing the dots right now, and
profiling, always showing off his bling, always talking about how much money he was making, how he dressed in the finest clothes, got all the women.
He was making it rain before Making It Rain was popular.
He was a gangster rapper before gangster rap. He really was. And this is what I mean about the reach of Ric Flair, was that he was able to transcend the professional wrestling industry and influence outside entertainment as well. And, you know, he still does. You still see him constantly showing up at football games, at basketball games, inspiring the team, showing up on the Jumbotron and giving a woo,
yeah.
so that and it pumps everybody up. You know, he's been on television shows and there's so many wrestlers and entertainers who have quoted Ric Flair as an inspiration to them or a guy that they've modeled themselves after. I mean, clearly within the professional wrestling industry, the two best examples are Triple H and Shawn Michaels, who have both said that Ric Flair was the man to them. And there's pictures of Shawn Michaels posing with a PWI where he's dressed like Ric Flair in the same stance. I mean, the list goes on and on and on about, you know, his influence. And you wanted to say something about that or make another point regarding that.
It's just that when he spoke, it felt real, and it felt motivational, either in motivating the viewer to want to see him lose when he was a heel. And let's face it, I mean, 85%, 90% of his career was spent as a heel. And boy, was he doing it well. And yeah, he still exuded that. Again, even in that era when he came back to the WWE, the fans were cheering for him out of the nostalgia, but then still booing him because of his association with Evolution and Triple H. That was becoming a lost art at that time. But as far as the entertainment aspect goes and what he was saying, his promo work was so good. And you've got all these other guys who were very good on the microphone that had their catchphrases. But what do these phrases mean? I mean, you can't use a ton of these in your everyday life. You know, if you smell what The Rock is cooking, it's hard to apply that to normal conversation. And that's the bottom line because Stone Cold said so. Okay, that's a little more. You can apply that a little bit more in your everyday conversation as a motivation. But his catchphrase, to be the man, you gotta beat the man.
That's it.
That is what else that it is. That is true. That is the true, one of the most true catchphrases. And he reflected that. Even a guy like Bret Hart, I'm the best there is, the best there was, the best there ever will be. Some will say, yeah. You could also argue that, no, he wasn't. Ric Flair. And Ric Flair's catchphrase wasn't even about himself. It was just, if you want to be the man, that guy watching me in the television right now, you want to be the man, whether it's in wrestling, whether it's at work, whether it's on the playground, you got to beat the man. And that's why people love Ric Flair.
Yeah, I mean, one of many reasons. And you talked about a guy that spoke, he was believable, like he lived the gimmick. He certainly did. Sometimes it got him in trouble. And that's something we're going to address coming up.
Some people listen to their podcast in the car. Me, I record mine in the car. So join me, Jeff DeHaan, for the Go Home Spot. It's where I'll talk everything from NXT, Raw, SmackDown, or whatever other wrestling-related stuff swims through my head. So join me for the Go Home Spot, only on the Wrasslun Show Network.
Okay, Matt, in the interest of fairness and trying to stay balanced, let's talk for a minute about a guy who lived and breathed the wrestling industry so much that sometimes the lines of reality and fiction were blurred past the point of recognizability. I don't think that's a word, but you know what I'm talking about. Beyond recognition. Ric Flair, so many Ric Flair stories out there about a guy who would just seem to, he was Homer Simpson, man. He just hated pants.
He certainly did hate pants.
All kinds of stories about plane rides where the nature boy was, well, let's just say he controlled the cockpit, if you will. And I wasn't referring to the airline
where the pilots sit.
Yeah, let's talk about that. And sadly, it did lead to a little bit of a more difficult life for him. You know, 4 marriages, never being home. A lot of wrestlers get caught up in the business and they can't live without it. They can't differentiate between the character and the person. And by all accounts, Ric Flair seems to be one of those guys. He had that road rage incident in back in the 2000s. I can't remember what year it was. But it wasn't pretty. And, we've heard all kinds of stories about, his conduct at a SummerSlam event that got Jim Ross fired somehow. I don't understand that. But point being that, Flair can sometimes be a cautionary tale as well. He is a guy that will have a legacy of this incredible wrestling career. But at the same time, he's also a cautionary tale for other wrestlers to say, but don't take it too far. I mean, I hate to say it, but let's face it, I'm sure that there's a lot of people, despite the fact that he does have pre-existing genetic conditions that have put him in this situation in the hospital, I'm sure nights out with the Horsemen where they would party all night until 5 o'clock in the morning and then get up at 7 to work out and then do it all over again the next day probably didn't help. Now, so that brings up the final question, and something you touched on earlier. Does that kind of go towards the argument that Ric Flair is maybe the greatest of all time? That he was a guy that completely lived the gimmick, that pushed it to the limit and well, kind of made the business his. He took control of it. And let's face it, when you do that list, that Mount Rushmore of the greatest of all time, Flair has to be on that list. Does he belong on top? That's the question. And clearly that's an unfair question because professional wrestling is a subjective art form.
And he was in it for so long and had to readjust not only his character, but his in-ring style constantly.
Yeah, 100%. And he did it. That's the thing. He managed to be on top everywhere he went. And as long as he was a part of those companies, he was the man, no matter where he went. And he continues to be the man. Nobody, I think, has commanded the respect of the industry, fans, journalists, the wrestlers, and promoters alike than Ric Flair. Sure, he's had heat and rivalries with other people, but nobody has sat there and ever said that they don't respect Ric Flair for what he can do. And that's kind of, I think, what makes him one of the greatest of all time.
And I think that respect has come a long way in the last couple of years. I think when Ric Flair was in his heyday, he was only Ric Flair, the Nature Boy. There was no other side to him. And in reading Bret Hart's book, there's a night where a lot of the guys from the WWF, when Ric Flair first came over, went and partied at his house, and Vince McMahon took a leak right on top of Ric Flair's bed, because that's the respect level they had for Ric Flair at that time. And I think it's come a long way into being more on the positive side within people in the business.
I just want to make sure I understood this correctly. Did you say that Vince McMahon took a leak on Ric Flair's bed?
Yep.
And
in Bret Hart's book, there's a bunch of guys partying at Ric Flair's house. No one knows where Flair is. And Vince McMahon got so drunk that he pulled his pants down and took a leak on Ric Flair's bed.
So you're saying Vince respected Flair so much that he was willing to get that sloshed?
No, I'm saying that there was the lack of respect there.
Oh.
And I'm saying that now the respect has grown.
Oh, okay. Good, because I was really confused there.
Sorry if I worded that incorrectly. Yeah,
no. I was
because
just
what I was saying was, like, he was so into being the Nature Boy, it didn't matter who he ticked off, because he was the Nature Boy, and that's all that mattered.
I was just worried about like some sort of weird custom that maybe I wasn't aware of, and I was going to say,
some kind of tradition.
You know, next time you're over for a pay-per-view, I think I'm going to put a little
Guess where I'm going.
I'm going to put a little bit of plastic over my bed.
Yeah.
Because I know you love me so much.
So anyway, that's yeah, I think now, in hearing interviews with him now, he was just on JR's podcast about a month or so ago, and there was no hint of the Nature Boy. He was just Rick.
Do you think that's a sad thing, or do you think it's a good thing?
No, I think it's a good thing because, as you said, he was the ultimate living the lifestyle of being a wrestling superstar that he couldn't differentiate real life. Real life for him was being a wrestler. Real life for him was when I'm away from the ring, I can still hear my theme music and I can still hear people cheering for me, and I still need to be up in everyone's face and prove that I'm the best, and no matter what I do. I think that's kind of subsided in the recent years. Maybe not completely, but it's certainly in the podcast. And it was just after JR's wife had passed away, so there were some very sincere moments in that conversation, and that was. I've seen Ric Flair in interviews outside and away from the arena and stuff, and like I'm saying, there's still that hint of woo and you know what you gotta do. Yeah, blah, 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 right? Even when he's singing Take Me Out to the Ball Game at Wrigley Field, he's still trying to be the man. In this interview with JR, it was finally like, okay, this is the guy that he probably is at home now.
I'll say this. The world, even sitting in a hospital bed, the world feels a little less awesome without Ric Flair out there wooing, drinking kamikazes, taking ladies to Space Mountain, and every other catchphrase that we've grown to love and adore. Our call to action is twofold this week before we wrap things up. First and foremost, we ask you to share this podcast with a fan of Ric Flair so that you may share some memories as well. I'm also going to recommend a match that you can watch, which is one of my favorites, the I Quit match with Terry Funk from Clash of Champions 9 in 1989. I love that match. I think it's one of his best and most underrated. Matt, do you have a match recommendation?
Just the ones I mentioned before, or go back and watch that trilogy of matches between him and Ricky Steamboat back in 89. Yes. 89. Awesome. That JR called in his very early days. So
yeah. Great stuff there. And one other one that I didn't have on my format, but I'm going to add in right now. If you're a spiritual person, pray for Ric Flair. If you're not, send good vibes to Ric Flair. For The Wrasslun Show, I'm at Adam Conta. That's at Matthew Sukram. And you know what to do. Listen, share, subscribe, repeat. Get well soon, Nature Boy.
This has been a presentation of the Wrasslun Show Network, where everything is wrestling.